One of the most common questions I get asked is, how did I deal with HIV back in the early days? In fact, when I was diagnosed, it wasn't even called HIV. It had a completely different name. We now obviously know it as HIV. In the early days, it was very, very frightening. Just to give you a bit of context, I was the second diagnosed case in Las Vegas, Nevada, in the United States, where I was living at the time. We knew nothing about how the disease was transmitted. All we knew was that there was a group of people who were dying from this disease, and everybody who had it essentially was basically on a death list. When I was diagnosed, there was no HIV test because, as we know, HIV didn't exist in those days in terms of the wording that we use. What they did do was they did what we call an immune assay. They looked at my immune system and they said, okay, how is the immune system functioning? A normal range of CD4 cells is anywhere from about 800 to 1200 in a healthy, normal human being. At that point in time, my CD4 count was below 400. It was at about 350, 360. And all the indicators that I had were things like thrush, which is a yeast infection in the mouth. I had swollen lymph glands. I had lost more than 10% of my body mass. There were numerous symptoms that led my doctors to believe that I had this thing called GRIDS. In those days, it was known as GRIDS. And that's when they came up with the diagnosis that I only had 6 months to live, get my affairs in order, and essentially that was it. There was nothing they could do for me. It was a very, very frightening period. There were no David patients that I could turn to in those days and say, what do I do? Who do I talk to? What can I take? None of that stuff existed. I was part of the pioneering groups or the trailblazing groups that set all those kinds of things into motion, establishing agencies, establishing HIV support, establishing care, establishing palliative care, helping people die, hospices and all those kinds of things. So it was a very, very scary period. As a result of people not knowing how it was transmitted, stigma was incredibly high in those days, as was all forms of bigotry towards anybody who had the disease. Unfortunately, my particular case reached the newspapers, and as a result of that, I lost my job, I lost my home, my dogs were poisoned, attempted poison anyway. I managed to get them to the vet so they were okay. I had people spray painting graffiti on the side of my house. I had people taking a key and running it down the side of my car saying, die, you deserve this. And you know, there was it was a very scary period. The reality of the situation is, for me though, I don't know that I would have behaved any differently had I been sitting on the other side of the fence, because we knew nothing about this disease. So I'm not judging the way people responded towards me in the early days, because the truth of the matter is I probably would have behaved exactly the same way had the shoe been on the other foot. In time, things have got dramatically better. Nowadays I hear people talking about stigma this and stigma that and all the rest of it. You have no idea what stigma looks like. Go back to the early 80s and understand what stigma looked like. I was a chef by training. As a result of being a chef by training and the fact that my HIV status hit the newspapers, clearly my cooking career went down the toilet very, very quickly. And that's when I started getting involved in working with people who are living with HIV and AIDS. The other question I get asked is how did your family respond when you told them you were HIV positive? Well, first of all, my family and I have always had quite a tenuous or a strained relationship. My parents and I have never had the same political views. We've never had the same views around racism and discrimination and all those kinds of things. Unfortunately, my parents are old school, so they come from an old mindset. So when I told them that I was HIV positive, once the test had been established, and that was established in 1985, once I told them that I was HIV positive and that I had this disease that was going to kill me, they essentially disowned me. They were living in South Africa and I was living in America, so it didn't really have a huge impact on me because it wasn't like we were in day-to-day contact with one another and living in each other's back pockets. I had left the country 3 years earlier, gone into exile in the States, and was living there and having an absolutely wonderful time. So the fact that my family didn't support me was not really that big of a deal. What didn't work for me was that between March and July of 1983, every person I told that I had this thing called GRIDS, which we now know as HIV, tended to basically run away screaming into the night, completely freaked out. You know, they would wash things. If I drank out of a teacup at their house, they'd throw the teacup away. You know, there was all those kinds of things that were taking place. So bigotry and stigma was very, very large back then. It is nothing today. Most of the stigma we know is not about people judging other people. What we know is that the stigma, and we've done the The stigma is now based on the fact that I have a family member who's HIV positive and I don't want my neighbor to find out. But the fact that my greengrocer or the fact that the person who serves me at the local restaurant is HIV positive is no reason for me to be scared or alarmed, because I now know through public education how HIV is spread and how it's not spread. So things have really changed dramatically. It was in about 1985, end of 85, beginning of 86, that I went on the first human trials of a drug called AZT. Now, back then, it was the first human trial, so they were trying to establish what kind of dosage was safe for human consumption. The drug had been developed for cancer research, and it was found to be way too toxic for human consumption, so it was simply put on a shelf and ignored for many years, until such time as all the HIV researchers started looking at HIV and going, well, hang on a second, HIV affects the same side of the immune system that cancer affects. Therefore, can we not use chemotherapy or forms of chemotherapy to treat HIV? And that's exactly what they did. The AZT was developed as a cancer protocol, and as I said, it was found to be too toxic for human consumption. So they pulled it off the shelf in about 1985, 1986, and they did a massive study across the whole of America with a whole bunch of people who were living with HIV, and they put them on the drug. Now, the dose in that day was 12 pills per day. All right, we're taking 2 pills every 4 hours, 24/7. So my life was controlled by a beeper that would go off every 2 hours, and I'd have to take this experimental drug. Well, the truth of the matter is we now know that that dose level was so toxic to human beings that a lot of the people who were on the original trials actually died as a result of taking too much AZT. Now, am I saying AZT is a bad thing? Absolutely not. I take AZT today. I only take 1 pill a day versus 12 pills a day. So there was a lot of people who literally gave up their lives and created the path that allows people today to access antiretrovirals. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the path that was laid so that so many people today can enjoy access to care, they can enjoy access to antiretrovirals. Their lives have changed dramatically from a disease that was once a very highly terminal disease to a disease that is simply a chronic, manageable disease. So antiretrovirals have changed the whole game. It wasn't until about 1995-96 that we started to see the effects of antiretroviral therapy, this whole new form of drug. Now, you've got to keep in mind that antiretrovirals are chemotherapy in a pill form. So when a person first starts taking the antiretrovirals, the body has got to get used to the amount of drug in the system. And it's a staggered approach. It's like every single day, your body builds up a little bit more of the drug, a little bit more of the drug. That coming or turning on to the drug, as we call it, it's a slang term, but you're turning onto the antiretrovirals, is a slow process for it to build up to a certain level in your body where it can maintain the dosage. That journey can take about 28 to 35 days from the time you start taking your antiretrovirals to the time that you reach the plateau where there's enough drugs in your body in order for it to become effective, start driving down the viral load and allowing your CD4 count to start going up.